I'm so excited to have Dr. Sydney Snyder and Dr. Diane Staehr Fenner on back the podcast. This time they brought Meghan uh, Gregoire-Smith to the podcast as well. The more the merrier to celebrate the second edition of a classic. Let me tell you, I've been in several districts like working with them, and they're like, yes, we've had a book study on unlocking potential. And I was like, we want to take what you do and take what they do and just like keep on building on what they're doing. I'm like, whoa, I don't know how much more I can build from that book. So congratulations on your second book.
And thank you for having us. And we also want to say thank you for your contributions to the second edition. We really appreciated that.
Oh, it's an honor to stand on such big, mighty shoulders. I'm just a little itty bitty person in the ecosystem that you've created for us. Can you tell us about how the first book was received, maybe specific success stories that really stood out before we
Sure,
go?
I'll go ahead and start. So yeah, we were very excited for our first book to come out in 2017, and it was received very well. So kind of ironically, the first place it came out was in Canada. So I was keynoting a conference, a Canadian ESL, English as a Second Language conference in Toronto, and it came out there that first day. And it's such a great feeling, as you know, Ton, to hold your baby for the first time, right? It's just so much work and just such a labor of love. So it came out at this conference and it was very well received. So just thinking about just some stories we heard along the way about people using it. A colleague of ours who was an adjunct professor in Iowa and also working with school districts K-12, she gave a great compliment. She said that the book teaches itself. So she loved using it in her classes because you could just kind of walk through it with students. And there were a lot of, Sydney and I were very intentional about creating a lot of application activities, a lot of practical activities, bringing the research to life and combining that with best practices. So yeah, so that was great to hear. Just a couple more stories. The first edition of the book, it was used in 5 different cohorts in Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, a district that Meghan and I have worked with in an ongoing way over several years now. It's been used in Reading school districts in Pennsylvania, across 5 middle schools and 9 elementary schools for their professional learning. So students used the first edition, as they are the second now, in a lot of professional learning communities, and we've just gotten great feedback about it.
I love that your colleague who's a adjunct professor, she said like, oh, the book teaches itself, and that's such a compliment because in university at times it's the ivory tower, it's really dense academic texts and very serious academic texts, but your book, well, what teachers really need is like, okay, how do I teach? And for a professor to say the book teaches itself, the participants love it, the teachers, the new teachers are taking it, and it's so helpful to them. That's such a huge compliment to write for teachers from teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. And all 3 of us, of course, have been in the field, have been teachers. So we know that, as teachers, you don't have time to be doing all of this research. And so we really wanted to share that with teachers so they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And so they could have the research at their fingertips, but in a way that it's applicable and not just a dense text that you kind of read and think, okay, this is great, but what do I do with this tomorrow as a teacher?
Right. It starts with theory, but then it goes into like, okay, so what does this look like in practice? So practical.
Exactly.
So in the second book, you brought Meghan with you. Meghan, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I am Meghan Gregoire-Smith, and I joined Diane's team at Support Ed in 2021. But before that, I was an ELD teacher in a district in Maryland, and I taught in elementary schools and in a central office there. And I actually, before I joined the support ed team, I actually used the unlocking text in my work a lot. So I did a lot of work supporting new ELD teachers and coaching them. And we would use the unlocking text, specifically the chapter on scaffolding, often as a starting place. So I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to be a part of this second edition. I'm still just blown away that my name is on that cover and I get to be a part of this with Diane and Sydney.
From using it in your work to being a co-author in the second one, how exciting. Would you tell us about the second book? How is it different than the first, and what has stayed the same?
Sure. I can talk about that a little bit. So since 2017 and the first edition came out, we've been doing a lot of work with districts and educators, and we really wanted to bring in some of the new strategies that we had been using with teachers and some of the strategies that we had seen in classrooms when we're in there for coaching. So it's just, we've layered in a lot of new strategies while keeping, those like traditional ones that you saw in the first edition. We also have revised chapter 8. As we know, research shows how important it is for our multilingual learners to be reading and writing across content areas. So we really wanted that to be the focus of chapter 8. So we're very excited about that. We also have included a section in each chapter about working with multilingual newcomer students and students with interrupted schooling. And that was just out of a need that we saw. Teachers are always asking us, but how do I apply this with my students who are new, to the country or who may have had interrupted schooling? So we really wanted to reflect in each chapter, okay, what could these strategies look like with that population or those populations? And then we're also just really excited because it's now in color, and our talented team member, Michelle Iris, did a great job with our graphics. So we just think it really helped bring our content to life. So those are a few of the changes.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and can I add one more thing?
Yes.
About the second edition? So it's interesting. You'll know this, Ton, when you write your second edition of your book, which I'm sure you can't even imagine right now. But a second edition is supposed to contain 20% new material. We definitely have way more than 20% new material in the second edition of the book. We haven't calculated it yet, but it's very significant that we build on the first and offer a lot of new strategies and new tools and updated research.
In particular, I think the section on newcomers is particularly important. So as we go through the words, sentence, and discourse level, I'd love for you to talk about that. So let's talk about, can you describe the framework for equitable and excellent ML instruction before we get into the program?
Sure, I can highlight a little bit of that. So, the real purpose is to define our core beliefs around teaching multilingual learners, which really frame the content for the rest of the book. And we also ask educators to examine their own beliefs. So it's really great to know the why behind your teaching of multilingual learners, because there can be some very tiring and days, right? You might be up against a lot of challenges. So it's really important to think about why we're doing this and what our beliefs are. So just to kind of highlight our core beliefs, I won't go into great detail, but we have 5 of them. And the first is that all around strengths. So multilingual learners bring many strengths to the classroom, and we always come back to student strengths. The second is the climate. So multilingual learners learn best when they're taught in a welcoming and culturally responsive school climate. The third is all about language. And this is the piece that everybody thinks of initially, but we need the whole picture to really be able to effectively and equitably and provide an excellent education for our multilingual learners. So the third is language, that multilingual learners acquire language and content when teachers purposefully integrate language development opportunities into meaningful content instruction. And we'll get into the academic language piece and how that all, and scaffolding and how that all fits in. The fourth is around conversations. So multilingual learners thrive when their teachers include opportunities for peer learning and meaningful conversations. And these core beliefs have shifted since the first edition of the book. And this piece really bubbled up that we saw in classrooms, especially post-pandemic, right? We really needed to focus on this peer learning, this interaction, this conversation and oral language to support content and language acquisition. And the fifth area is, of course, one dear to my heart, advocacy, that multilingual learners excel when teachers and administrators collaborate, advocate, and lead in support of their students' academic achievement and social emotional well-being. So those were some new nuances of our 5 core beliefs.
Right. I mean, those 5 by themselves is like a master's degree. If you're able to learn each of those things, you have a master's degree in ML instruction. But I'm happy that it's in a concise chapter, so that it can be the thread through the rest of the book.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about you talked about oral language, oral literacy. Can you share what the research has talked about in fostering ML oral literacy?
Yes. So we were so excited to have the opportunity to update and revamp this chapter on supporting ML's oral language development through peer learning opportunities. Just like Diane was saying, we updated those core beliefs and we added that belief around conversations, right? That MLs really thrive when their teachers include those opportunities for peer learning and meaningful conversations into instruction. And so we've spent time in classrooms and districts, and we've really seen the need to build in more opportunities for that student to student discourse, because like you said, the research supports that. In 2017, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they published a research synthesis on MLs, and they really identified peer learning as one of the promising and effective practices for MLs in grades K to 12. And we know that peer learning opportunities really support language acquisition, literacy development, content learning, and they also really build students' thinking skills and peer relationships and student engagement and motivation. And Diane and I have had the opportunity to engage in some student focus groups over the last couple of years, where we actually talk to students about how they feel about their education. And we often hear them talk about how much they enjoy those small group interactions, the opportunities to talk to their peers. So not only does the research support that it supports language acquisition and content learning, but students enjoy it. So it really supports engagement. And then it also provides teachers a really great opportunity for formative assessment, right? So teachers can be listening in on these rich conversations and get a sense of, how students' language is developing and their understanding of content. So this is one of my favorite chapters, my favorite, pieces to really bring to life with teachers. And so in the chapter, we really focus on developing activities that provide our MLs really authentic opportunities to talk. And of course, with those scaffolds embedded. So Sydney brought up that we focus in on our newcomer MLs and our students with interrupted education. And I think what comes up for teachers sometimes when they're thinking about peer learning opportunities is, how am I going to make sure that all students are able to fully participate, even those students that are just beginning to learn English. And so we suggest 4 key practices to really prepare our MLs to be able to engage in these activities. So the first is to come to the discussion prepared. So how are we preparing students? Are we pre-teaching vocabulary, providing them some think time or time to discuss ideas in their home language? And then the second is to be aware of nonverbal communication. So taking the time to really explicitly teach students about what nonverbal communication looks like, specifically in our culture, because it might be different from where they're coming from. And then the third is around participating by taking turns. So this is something that we need to intentionally teach, right? That when we're engaged in a conversation, we're taking turns. There's a speaker and a listener. So we can really scaffold up to this through things like speaker and listener cards or talking chips and things like that. And then our final suggestion is around making connections. So that's both making connections to their learning. So when they're engaged in these conversations, making a connection to their learning about the content, their prior knowledge, but then also making connections to others. So asking follow-up questions and, building on each other's ideas. And so in order to engage in these peer learning activities, we share a bunch of different activities that teachers can bring into their classroom. And one of my favorites is the 1-3-6 protocol. So I don't know if you've heard of that one, but that's one where students are moving from a smaller group to a larger group. So that one is they're working independently. They're thinking about a discussion prompt that you gave them or a task to complete, and they're maybe thinking about it, writing about it, and then they move into a group of 3 to discuss it with a smaller group. And then after that, 2 groups of 3 come together in a group of 6. So you're slowly building up to larger groups and giving students opportunities to practice language in multiple ways, hear it from different people, and kind of build their confidence that way. So our intention with the activities that we highlight in this chapter is that they provide repetition of language and an opportunity for students to practice language in a safe way. So our hope is that this chapter really helps teachers be able to embed these peer learning opportunities into instruction regularly.
I mean, I was so excited to see this chapter because peer learning is so important. One of the truism that I've gained through my years of teaching is that students don't come to school for us. They don't come to school to learn. They really come to school to be with their friends. And if they happen to come to school with their friends, let's make that the structure for learning. So your chapter on peer learning through oral language is fantastic. Would anybody like to add on like what does this look like, oral language development look like for newcomers because they're unable to read and write in English yet?
Yeah, Tan, I really like how you mentioned how kids come to school for their friends, right? So really, in the case of newcomers, building on the strong oral traditions that students may, most likely are bringing with them, and building on also any of those friendships, right? Like not being able to leverage their home language and encourage translanguaging and just starting with that asset, right? Our first core belief that our multilingual learners come with many assets, and being intentional about building on that and sharing with students, the gains that they're making, helping make that visible to students. So just, really reflecting on what it is they're bringing with them, and then sharing that with other teachers as well. So all teachers can start to see that they do bring assets, and with, intentional scaffolds and supports, they will make gains. It might be incremental. We're not going to see it overnight, especially with newcomers, but it's, we have to put in that extra effort to be able to see those gains.
Yeah, the old paradigm when I was an ESL student was, no, Tan shouldn't use his Vietnamese to learn English. But now it's like, yes, let's have him use Vietnamese with his Vietnamese friends to learn content and to learn language. And so it's no more English limited proficient. It's, English is not the only focus. It's what can you do with your languages? And that's an
right. It is. And when teachers structure their activities in a way, the students are going to be engaged and they're going to be using their home language as part of the task. They're not going to be off task if there's the expectation and the structure built in for these peer conversations.
Even if they're just learning something new, they can still process like turn and talk in Spanish. Before we get to the English part. Like, we'll help you get the English, but let's just process the content which you learned in Spanish. Meghan, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just as I've been listening to you and Diane share, it came up for me just thinking about the importance of intentional pairing when we're setting up these peer learning activities, right? So for our newcomers, really thinking about who are their friends, who do they feel comfortable with, and pairing them together before we ask them to share with, other students in the class that they might not be as comfortable with. So really, thinking about who those friends are and leveraging that.
Intentionality is the central word for our practice.
Absolutely.
Let's move to talking about academic language. I feel like your book is really like the subtitle is like unlocking academic language. Right? And so you've really developed, you really focus on dimensions of academic languages, such as word level, sentence level, discourse level, and then you go through reading and writing. So let's start with the first, the word and phrase level. What are your suggestions in this chapter?
Absolutely. Like you said, academic language is a big focus in the book. So we have 2 chapters dedicated to developing academic language. And if you read the first edition, you'll notice that in the second edition, we've really reworked these chapters to build up from that word phrase level up to the discourse level. And so we really lean on WIDA's definition of academic language as a starting place, like you said, with those dimensions, the word phrase to the sentence to the discourse level. So when we're talking about the word phrase level, right, we're talking about that everyday, the cross-disciplinary, technical words and phrases that add precision to language. And so in our work with educators, we've really found that the word phrase level tends to be an area of strength for teachers, right? And so we try to offer ideas and suggestions to really build upon that strength. And at the beginning of this chapter, we really acknowledge that vocabulary learning happens in 2 ways, right? We have that explicit teaching of vocabulary that is planned. The teacher is planning that out. They've got the visuals, the student-friendly definitions, and we're intentionally teaching that vocabulary. But then there's also that incidental vocabulary learning that happens just through students engaging in activities, just talking to their friends throughout their life, right? You're learning vocabulary all the time. So we kind of lean on both of those ideas through our suggestions in the chapter. And so I think your question was about how we really support language development at the word phrase level. And so we share 3 practices that we suggest. So the first is to really teach that new vocabulary, right? So intentionally pick words that are going to cross content areas that have multiple meanings and teach those words with student-friendly definitions, bring in images, realia, examples, non-examples. And then once we've explicitly taught those words, provide time to practice that vocabulary with multiple modalities, right? We want students listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and really using those words in context, right? Not just knowing that word and the definition, but how do I actually use it within a sentence, right? So we suggest lots of different activities, fun games for students to practice using that vocabulary. And then our third practice is around kind of supporting that more incidental learning of vocabulary. So supporting independent learning of new words. Students, of course, are going to encounter words that they don't know as they read text just throughout their day. So giving them some strategies that they can lean on to help them when they encounter those new words. So teaching about how we can use context clues, what word parts are and what they mean, cognates and false cognates. So those are our 3 big suggestions in the chapter. And one of my favorite parts of this chapter is the opening. So we have ELD teacher and a good friend of mine, Jennifer Saunders. She explains the strategies that she uses to teach and practice and assess her MLs vocabulary development. And I think it kind of really brings a lot of these ideas to life. So that's something we're really proud of in this book, is that we're able to bring a lot of teachers' voices and examples into the book.
What do you do when you, because when I work with teachers, we work with vocabulary, but they want to sometimes just find like 20 words from a text. And then they move to the next text and then they'll look at another 20 words. And we're like, and the teacher's like, I don't understand why kids don't understand these 40 words. So what are your suggestions? I see all you smiling.
So in the chapter, we really highlight that we should focus on a small number of keywords, right? I think our suggestion is 5 to 8 words that we're really focused on, and being really intentional about how we select those words. Is it a multiple meaning word? Is it a word that they'll see in multiple content areas? And we give suggestions around what words not to teach or what could be taught just in context, right? That we don't need to spend a lot of time on. So we try to give a lot of suggestions to really focus teachers in on focusing on a small number of words, because we can't teach every single word that students are going to encounter.
Yeah. Yeah, and just building on that, our reason for suggesting a small number of words is borne out in the research, right? So we really draw heavily from a meta-analysis of high-quality research that says you're going to have more effects, more positive effects if you choose a small number of words, like 5 to 8 words. And that, like Meghan said, you can share the why about why you're choosing these words. So knowing kind of your high leverage or words that you get a lot of bang for your buck from. So, teachers have very limited time. So choosing your words, your vocabulary words and phrases very wisely that are going to help move your students along in your very limited amount of time. That's one of the best approaches.
And I just wanted to add on, when we're talking about students who are newcomers, we might want to have different sets of words, right? So what can we do to really pre-assess student understanding? Because we don't want students to be spending a lot of time practicing words they already know. And at the same time, we want to make sure that our students who are at lower levels of proficiency are getting the words that are really essential to that content. So they're focusing their time on that. So I think that's another important piece when we're working with teachers.
Currently, I'm doing revolutions with my 9th graders, and one of the key words that we're learning is the word representation. And so, because revolutions happen because of lack of representation in the power struggles, and the king doesn't give people the peasants representation in the French Revolution, which is the same thing in the American Revolution. So, I just focus on using those words instead of the word monarchy, right? And so that isn't going to appear again and again, but representation is so huge. So that's just an example. Let's look at the next, moving from the word level to the sentence level. What can you, let's talk about that.
Sure. So I think, as Meghan mentioned, generally teachers are more comfortable with teaching vocabulary. So then when we start talking about sentence and discourse, some teachers can get a little nervous, right? You want me to be a grammar teacher? What do you expect from me? So in this chapter, we really try to break it down with very concrete strategies. And the chapter opens with a scenario from a kindergarten classroom. I had the great fortune to work with a kindergarten teacher, Anna Zavala, and I saw how she used morning meeting to get those students practicing sentence level academic language. Like, she was bringing in the math, she was bringing in the literacy. And I'm just like, if you can do it with kindergarten, you can do it at any grade level, right? So that is one of my favorite parts of the chapter. But when we're talking about sentence level, our colleague and friend, Dr. Katie Topple, contributed a couple examples to this chapter. And one is structured sentence books. And what I really like about this, so in the example in the book, she's using it for a unit on bets. But she talks about being very strategic about giving students sentence stems. So we all, sentence stems are a common strategy, right? A lot of teachers use them. But what I appreciate about what she's saying is we can use those stems to provide opportunities for students to develop more complex language structures. So maybe it's a cause and effect language, maybe it's a complex sentence. So I think that's something, really being strategic about the stems that we're providing in order to support the academic language that we're hoping to hear. So that's one strategy. She also provides a strategy that's just a picture description. So giving students a picture that's based on the content they're talking about it. And thinking about how you could differentiate that activity for students at different levels of proficiency level. So maybe you're asking students at higher levels to give you more complex sentences, whereas students at lower levels, maybe they're identifying key vocabulary from that picture. So those are 2 sentence level strategies that I think are great.
Dr. Katie Topple is amazing. I would say that if I always tell colleagues when they're looking for a specialist who is focused on elementary MLs, I'm like, please go learn from Katie Topple. I'm waiting for her to have her own book. I know that she just finished her book with the SIOP authors, but I'm just waiting for her to have her own book. She's like, I'm just too busy to write. I'm like, I'll be the first person to buy 100 copies of your book, Katie, when you're ready.
She has so many practical ideas, I think.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Would you talk to me about the morning meeting? You said with at the sentence level, with with the first graders, your colleague that you saw. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So in the morning meeting, of course, she starts with the calendar and they talk about what day is yesterday, what day is tomorrow. But then she also does a lot with math. So using like 10 frames to have students talk about how many days have they been in school? How many days do they have left? And for all of those, she's encouraging them to make complete sentences. So she's modeling it. She has very structured sentence patterns that she's using. And you could see, I worked with her over the course of a year, how those students strengthened their language use throughout the year. Like it became so routine. And then they're taking that math language and they're using it when they go into math too. So it's like thinking about how something like a morning meeting can really be an opportunity to practice that academic language, throughout the day. It doesn't just have to be during math time, right? Or science time.
Yeah, it's embedding opportunities for students to use academic language structures the whole time. I wonder is there anything that because you mentioned sentence starters and sentence frames. Are there anything that at the sentence level that you recommend teachers to be cautious of doing or overdoing at the sentence level? Or we can go back to the vocabulary as well. Is there anything that you would recommend like teachers not overdo?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess so. One strategy that we talk about at the sentence level is like deconstructing sentences. And again, we ask the teachers be strategic in the sentence that they choose, giving students an opportunity to analyze that and then practice making their own. So I think that's an amazing strategy. But again, you're not going to want to do that every day, right? So I think part of that when we're thinking about any of these strategies is being intentional, as you mentioned, and strategic about their use.
Yeah, and we in our work with support ed, we do a lot of coaching and classroom visits, so we get to see this growth over time. And honestly, this is an area, the sentence level academic language, that I have never seen overuse of, like when I've been in classrooms. So I don't know if I think just, incorporating a couple of these strategies into your repertoire, not using them every day, but, having them in your toolbox is going to be a great way to help, increase students' proficiency and academic language. So like personally, I haven't seen an overuse, but maybe I will someday as this book gets into every teacher's hands. They'll just be, really looking forward to using the sentence level strategies. And we do in this chapter, we do help kind of navigate the unfamiliar territory of the grammar, right? So we spent a long time, we really wanted to be sure that teachers, we don't think teachers need to know every single term, every single structure to be able to voice it. We're not expecting teachers to be linguists as well as, all their other hats. But we do want to provide a reference for what we're talking about, so teachers feel more comfortable, because this area can be really uncomfortable. Like if you didn't enjoy grammar in your own schooling, you're probably not going to feel comfortable teaching it to your students. So we wanted to give everyone just a common focus and a common point to come back to in this chapter.
Would you go a little more into that? Like, how did you structure grammar instruction at the sentence level?
Just giving names to what we're talking about, like dependent clauses, independent clauses, giving examples, so teachers are aware of that. And so if they choose to, they can, put a name to what they're talking about with their students. And I've seen some teachers do this just so well for their multilingual learners, and also the native English speakers or fluent speakers in the group are also going to benefit from this, from taking a deeper dive on academic language. And we really we're definitely proponents of weaving in mini academic language lessons along with content learning. There's so many great opportunities to do this throughout the day, to just take a 5-minute detour, and it's going to help strengthen students' understanding of the content. It is so worth it to, just to weave this in and to build this in for all students, especially, a lot of people say, oh, this is just good teaching, right? For everybody. But, it is good teaching, but for multilingual learners, it is critical and it's a non-negotiable.
If there is go ahead.
I was just going to say one new activity that we added to chapter 6 is an activity where we have some classroom scenarios, and it gives an opportunity for our readers to look at those scenarios and think, oh, at the word level, sentence level, and discourse, and think, what would I do next to support this student's language development? So we kind of describe how they're producing language related to the content. And I think that reflection piece is so important, right? For teachers to think, oh, this is what my students are doing now. How can I take them to that next level?
It seems like sentence level writing is all the rave. There's a new recent book out there by Corin about sentence level writing with instruction for MLs. And one of the classics in the field, classics 2017, is The Writing Revolution by Judith Hoffman. Like that book has revolutionized the way I write. I teach writing now. So for example, we just learned about we looked at the American Revolution, and I'm having students use the word even though comma to process the American Revolution. And then even though we can use, like, there's another way we use even though. Let's use the but in the middle of a sentence. So the colonists comma but the king So they're seeing two concepts of even though in the beginning, and we put even though in the middle, it turns into a but. Or if we take a but in the middle and we put in the beginning, it becomes even though. So it's just a fantastic way to teach content and language development. Let's move to the discourse level, structuring sentence, the sequencing of ideas.
Great. So a couple of activities that we have for that is really giving opportunities and really giving students an opportunity to analyze how texts are put together and think about how they're organized differently across content areas. So how does a poem look different from a science text, for example? Because once they become more aware of these differences, then they're going to be able to produce it in their own writing. So we do talk about a sequencing activity there where you can take either a paragraph or a speech and you cut it up. And then you have students work in groups to sequence it and look for those clues, right? What are the clues that help them know what's the first sentence and what's the last sentence? And again, you can scaffold that for students at lower levels of proficiency to provide them, maybe you provide them with the first and last, and they just have to do the middle three. So there's different ways of doing that. We also include there like a text analysis, or really looking at a text that's designed for a specific purpose. And Tan, you have a great blog post on this that we talk about, that we reference in the book, but really giving students an opportunity to deconstruct that text that you've specifically chosen. And then giving an opportunity, again, working in pairs to write their own versions of that text. And you talk about like giving them specific language structures that you want to see included. And I think the example that you just shared is a great example of that. So those are just a couple of strategies we use for we talk about for discourse.
Yeah, and I do, if it's okay, want to highlight just one strategy that kind of cuts, undergirds the whole book, is first practicing these strategies and these tasks with non-academic content. So for example, this sequencing activity, you can use a text that the students are familiar with, or maybe something really based experientially on their lives that they can relate to, so they understand what's expected first, and then applying it, for example, Tanya, even though, using kind of everyday language first, more social language, so they understand what's expected and they get used to that structure, and then having them, you apply it to something a little more complex and academic.
That's exactly right. When we learned the word concept of even though, we said, even though Phnom Penh is a lovely city, comma, and so they all live in Phnom Penh. They gave their experience like,
yes,
oh, there's traffic, and then we changed it to something else because most of my students are athletes, and I said, even though I didn't make the A team for there's multiple levels of team sports, comma, students, and then they answered, oh, I can still be part of the B team or the C team, or I can do the after school activity. And so they're learning that. And so when they go to talk about the American Revolution, when I ask them to say, please write a sentence with the word even though about the American Revolution, they've already had that practice. Let's move to reading and writing in content areas, because we do academic language at the word, sentence, discourse level for the purpose of academic reading and writing.
Again, this is a new chapter that we're really excited about. And I feel like it connects so closely to our peer learning chapter, because really this chapter is all about building those peer learning routines that are going to support our students in reading and writing. So a couple of strategies that we have is first thinking about with reading, how do we really tap into that prior knowledge? So as Diane talked about, thinking about students' assets, right? What do they already know? What do they already experience? So one activity that we share in there is a gallery walk where students are just looking at images from the topic that they're going to be reading. It could be from the text, or it could be other images you're bringing in. And then they have an opportunity to talk about that in pairs. And again, for our students who might be at lower levels of language proficiency, our newcomer multilingual learners, giving them those stems or some key vocabulary that they might need ahead of time to practice that. And again, as Diane said, really modeling this first with a non-academic topic. So we're building those routines so that then as you do that throughout the year, it's going to become easier and easier for them to engage. Like, oh, we know how to do this, right? And they're going to be more comfortable talking. Some of the writing strategies that we use, again, opportunities to talk first, right? So how can you have them work in pairs to really brainstorm ideas for their writing, using something like color-coded writing, where students are working in pairs or small groups and they're writing together, but they might have different colors that they're using. So as a teacher, you can see who wrote what, but at the same time, they're still having an opportunity to talk and work together. So those are a couple of our strategies in there.
Does anybody want to add anything to that? By reading and writing?
Just that we knew this needed to be a much bigger focus in our second book, just based on what we'd been, seeing out in the field with teachers. And just giving teachers some practical ideas of, what they can replicate, what they can try, and what's definitely going to benefit, to benefit multilingual learners. We take a little look at scaffolding, reading and writing in mathematics, because that's an area where we've seen, teachers really need more support, right? That there is no universal language of math. Maybe there used to be when we were just doing like computations, but there is so much language in math, and we have to be very intentional about scaffolding our students' access to content in math. There's so much that goes into math instruction for multilingual learners, and we do give some strategies in the chapter as well to support our multilingual learners as they learn language and develop their skills in math as well.
I'll just add something also that we talk about in the chapter, which something I'm really passionate about now, is thinking about how we engage students in self-assessing their own progress. So in the chapter, we share some checklists that students can use, and we talk about writing conferences. So really having, and I know time can be a constraint for that, but thinking about how can you build in opportunities for them to think about their own language development and what are their goals and where do they want to improve. I think that is so powerful for students.
And I wanted to jump in and just share one of my favorites from this chapter that as we've started using this book with teachers, it has really resonated with some of the teachers that I've worked with, this idea of amplifying text rather than simplifying it to help students access it. So, the bolding of keywords, embedding definitions, adding images to the text to really help our students be able to access that complex text that we know they're going to need to access for grade level content. So I really like some of the activities we have in there to highlight how we can do that.
That reminds me of the person who works for West Ed in the West Coast. She Alquin, Dr. Alquin, she talked about text engineering.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is something that teachers have been doing naturally, but now they have a name for it. And that's really empowering to see, what you may have been doing all along, like, oh, it's actually, we have a name for this and it's called something. And, it can be very, super beneficial for students when we're amplifying instead of watering down or only giving home language text. We really want to have students work towards that grade level text and grade level content. So it's just so important.
What do we do now in the age of AI when we can simply say, take this text and put it at a grade 4?
Yeah, we have to be just so careful, right? In AI and use our own professional expertise. Because we've all kind of played around with AI, at Support Ed with a very outcomes. Some things have just been, kind of scary still to see what can happen. So it definitely has its place. And I think we just really need to be cautious.
The way I use it is when I go to co-teach in my classes. So for example, I was working with my students in grade 10 and they're looking at urban development in Phnom Penh. And there's an article about it and it's so intense. And we just said, please turn this article into a grade 4. So the student is researching and it's now able to access urbanization in Phnom Penh. But when he goes to my class, we're reading on-level grade level text. That's not AI, that it's text engineered, that's scaffolded, but without amplifying the text, without reducing the rigor of the text. So I see AI as as a way to help students process content. But when they come to my English class, they still get to develop their academic literacy muscles for reading really difficult, rigorous texts. Let's move to the last part of your book, which is about assessment. Can you talk about designing and using formative assessments for MLs?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about that. And so this is a topic that is, I'm very passionate about, among others in the book. In Fairfax County schools in Virginia, for a while, I was in the central offices, their ELD assessment specialist. So I got to learn a lot about validity and how, just assessment is such a huge area of potential inequities for our multilingual learners. So the advocacy thread definitely through this chapter. And so, advocacy is crucial. And just thinking about, assessment in general, some teachers can feel very powerless in this area. You feel like you really can't, do anything, that you're sometimes up against a brick wall. But the area of formative assessment really allows teachers to use their creativity and to really draw from their professional expertise and design formative assessments that are valid for students and really provide information that's going to help them adjust their teaching. And that's the key, right? So having these regular checkpoints that are testing what they're designed to test, and where students are involved in the process, as Sydney mentioned, where students are doing self-reflection along the way and having a voice and constructing assessments. And formative assessments is not only a way to empower teachers, but also multilingual learners when they're involved in the process, in their learning, when they're setting goals. And so again, the idea is that teachers use their information, their data from formative assessment to adjust their instruction. And in this chapter, we walk the readers through a 4-step process for formative assessment. So articulating the construct being taught and assessed. So are you assessing verb tense? Are you assessing content learning? And making sure that students are aware of what's being assessed. So we're huge proponents of student-friendly rubrics. So students are, they know what they're being assessed on, that they see models of what the teacher is expecting. So they know what they're working towards. And the second step in the process is collecting the evidence. So how are we going to collect the evidence? Is it a checklist? Is it a rubric? Is it an exit? Are we using a rubric? Is it an exit ticket? Is it just a fill in the blank little exercise, for example? Are we walking around as students are having these peer learning conversations? So it comes back to peer learning all the time, right? Do we have a checklist? Are we taking conferring notes, for example, and using that in our instruction? So the third step is interpreting the evidence, making sense of all of this data that you have now. So what is it? What does it mean? And what are we going to do with it? And then the fourth step is using the assessment data to plan for this ongoing instruction. So now that you know this information, what changes will you make? What students, might you need to reteach something to? How might you group students differently the next time to really draw from their strengths? So this is, we love kind of ending the book with this chapter, but we feel that assessment shouldn't be a standalone. It needs to be woven throughout all of our instruction. And you'll see throughout all of the chapters, there are ways to take, what we share and turn these tools into formative assessments for students. So, that's how we like to end the book.
It reminds me of like your last chapter, formative assessment, reminds me of like a plane. A plane gets to its destination because the second it takes off, it's constantly readjusting. We can't feel the readjustment. Hopefully we don't feel the readjustment when we're on a plane, but it's so slight and gentle. And it goes back to your peer learning. Like we can just adjust our lesson by listening to students' conversations and moving them slowly towards the goal where we need to go. So let's end the podcast with this in our last 4 minutes. Let's pretend that you are writing, when you go and do book talks and when you go and do book signings, you usually write a small little comment to teachers. What would you like to write to teachers orally through this book? If you were to give every single audience member listening to the podcast a little message personally from you to them in the inside cover of your book, what would it be?
I'll go first. When I'm signing books, and I remember the first time I did it, I had to Google, what do you write in a book? Because I had no idea. And you have limited space. And then, anyway. So just one thing I would want to write is that, you have the tools already at your fingertips. So it's just, this book will help you draw from what you already have and build on your own strengths to really bring out our multilingual learners' strengths.
I'll just say that when I sign, I always say thank you for all you're doing every day to unlock multilingual learners' potential, because we know how hard teachers work and how creative they are and empowering. So I think, really thank you. And we hope that, some of these strategies are helpful to add some new tools to your toolbox.
And I actually have never signed a book yet. So I'm thrilled for when I get to. But I think that the big thing I would start with is that thank you to teachers, right? Thank them for picking up this book and taking the time to really think about how they can better support their multilingual learners, and that I hope this book brings them some new tools for their toolbox. So I think just that big thank you to teachers.
Well, the field has already been thanking you since 2017 when your first book came out. And when you announced the second book, I was like, how are they going to improve a one-in-a-generation book? And they did it. And so congratulations on your second book, not just 20% new, but a whole lot new. And we're so with gratitude for your contribution to the field. So thank you, Sydney, Meghan, and Diane.